Hello and welcome to all of you here and online to Supporting Your Son's Mental Wellness, a Conversation. My name is Leanne Castellino. I'm the Director of Marketing and Brand Strategy here at St. Michael's College School. On behalf of all of our staff present, we thank you for being here for Parent Talks at St. Michael's College School, and it's a first. This is the first time the school is live streaming an event of this kind. That's because we strongly believe that what you will hear today is critical information for you, parents within our community and beyond, to know about. To watch online, go to @SMCS 1852 on Facebook. This event is made possible through the efforts of our Student Affairs Department, led by Mr. Frank Trenadu, and Community Partnerships, led by Mr. John Walsh. The Student Affairs Department comprises Guidance, the Learning Enrichment Center, and the Odette Library. Community Partnerships facilitates opportunities to advance student learning through real-world exposure via meaningful partnerships with individuals and organizations. I will invite Mr. Trenadu now to say a few words.
Parents and school staff are key partners whose participation are both essential and valued. Parent Talks is a new initiative that is meant to address varying topics relevant to students. Today's presentation is the first in this series and the second of 3 layers in the mental health strategy addressing issues of concern. The first layer was a conversation with members of the Student Affairs Department and Dr. Broussenko. The second is to have a conversation with parents with the intention of working as partners in the education of the boys. The final layer will be to address the boys themselves. Thank you for coming. We hope you find tonight's conversation helpful.
If you have questions throughout the course of the presentation, feel free to use social media to communicate them to us. You can send your questions via Twitter to @SMCS 1852 and use the hashtag ParentTalkSMCS, as we see up on the slide. Or you can also email parenttalks@smcsmail.com, and we will strive to have them answered during the course of this evening. The format for this inaugural presentation has been designed to maximize the information shared and also to ensure a meaningful dialogue. To that end, our guest will be addressing 3 main themes, each within 20 minutes. This includes questions at the end of each 20-minute block. We have 3 wireless microphones that will be circulating in the room, so we just ask that you raise your hand and indicate where you're sitting, and the microphone will come to you. Now it's time to welcome our special guest this evening. Dr. Mark Broussenko is a family physician who makes house calls. He is also a hospitalist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, also known as CAMH, and he is an alumnus of St. Michael's College School. Dr. Broussenko will present each of today's 3 themes with a brief presentation based on evidence-based research before we take your questions. Our first theme this evening is mental wellness. Dr. Broussenko?
Thanks so much, Leanne. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks to everyone for coming to see me tonight. I've been told that I can only go a little circle around here, otherwise this whole thing falls apart. So I apologize if I don't come to you in person. Just a quick overview as to why you're here. I understand that the Raptors are playing today at 8, so thanks very much for giving up that important evening to come listen to me. As Leanne mentioned, I am a grad of 2007, and I was actually going to put up my graduating photo in that little black space over there, and then my parents actually sent it to me as a text message this morning, and I immediately realized that, you know, in the decade and a half since I left the school, I've at least learned how to make it so that my hair doesn't look like a mop on my head. So there's progress, there's hope. And so I did my family medicine residency at U of T, and I am currently one of the emergency medicine hospitalists at CAMH. I also, as Leanne mentioned, do some after-hours house calls, and then I do some teaching and supervision at Toronto Western. And as those of you who were kind enough to hear me kind of pitch this idea at the Parent-Teacher Association last month, the point of this is to make this accessible for everyone. So by no means do I pretend like I'm an expert in raising children. There's not going to be a Dr. Broussenko book for how to raise your son in like 11 steps that I'm going to pitch to you at the end of this talk. But if anyone knows a good ghostwriter, I'm in the market. But the point is that, you know, I was a child, right? And I was a student that went here and not that long ago, and I dealt with some of these issues myself. And right now, for better or worse, I do see a lot of young adults who struggle with some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And my goal and my hope with some of these conversations is how to help you steer your sons so that they don't end up seeing me in my emergency department. Because that's really the end of the road, right? That's a place where I don't want to meet your children for the first time. And there's some strategies that we can explore to avoid that. So there's no disclosures. You know, I'm not affiliated with any organizations, as I mentioned. I'm not paying. I'm not selling anything to you. But part of this is, you know, the school has asked me to come speak to you. And so it behooves me to then ask that you grade me, right? This wouldn't be a school if there wasn't a time limit and a test at the end where someone tells you how well you did. So my time limit is an hour, and each of you are holding one of the evaluation forms. So if you like it, great. If you don't like it, also please tell me. That way that these things can be structured a little bit better in the future. So, you know, I was going to start with a little roadmap, but I figured I'd just make a little joke slide instead. There's going to be a series and an order to this madness here, and that order is going to start with more general, and it's going to go to more specific, and that's intentional. So we have less than an hour. You know, I can't cover the entire topic of adolescent mental health in a day, much less an hour, and I certainly wouldn't be able to have a conversation with you back and forth. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw out some highlights, both from the things that I've seen in my practice and my experience, and some of the questions that you've asked in preparation for this that we'll cover. So the first theme is going to be general wellness, and you know, how to teach and how to encourage students to develop some resiliency-based skills to deal with some of the challenges that they face as students. The second question is going to be about illicit drugs, and then the third question, and this is what I think everyone's most interested in, is going to be vaping. And it speaks to the severity of this problem that, you know, of my 60-minute conversation, a full third of it is going to be on how to have it so that your children don't get cancer from a flash drive. Not my joke, someone else's. So these are some of the early objectives, and they kind of cover each of those areas of interest. And so moving on to the first question, which is, you know, very importantly asked is my son sad? And you'd be surprised how often I get this, because the spectrum between, you know, healthy, well-adjusted teenagers and sad teenagers is sometimes a little bit hard to differentiate. And so in case you're wondering where I got this picture from, this is a site that collects, that's supposed to be a photo album of trending things on the internet. And there's a bunch of these. So some group of kids decided that this was a good idea, and then they needed to share this and make it so that all of their friends know that holding up a balloon in front of your face means that you're sad. So one of the things that I wanted to underpin, and this extends from one of the conversations that I'd had with the guidance counselors and that team a couple months ago, was the development of the teenage brain. So the development of the teenage brain is roughly backwards in terms of volitional control. And so this is about as much science as we're going to go through here. So the more primitive part, the hippocampus, develops first, whereas the more important parts, the parts that control, you know, decision-making and impulsive behavior, so the prefrontal cortex, develop last. And they continue to develop well into people's mid-20s. And so the practical application of this, so this is the part where alcohol works. So the practical application of this is you can assume that any teenager is about 2 to 4 drinks deep at any given moment. Like flat out. So, you know, and this is why we also don't let them drive for a while. But in practical terms, in terms of decision-making and the impulse control that you get, and in terms of your emotional availability and response, your sons are operating with a prefrontal cortex that at its best is partially impaired. And certainly when you add on stressful situations, add on drugs or alcohol or learning impediments, that degree of impairment becomes, for some children, profound. But in case you're wondering, why am I having a hard time relating to my child? Why does my child make impulsive decisions? Why can't they appreciate the future? It's because they've got beer goggles on going on through life. This is essentially an unassailable feature of human development. And the way that you deal with that is by understanding and by planning, right? So if you know that this is the baseline for your son, and this is the baseline of what's going to happen, your expectations are going to change. So a large part of my job, especially in the mental health and wellness sphere, is expectations management. So the idea that someone comes to you and says, what are you going to do I'm going to be happy in 3 months is unrealistic. So it's a very similar thing in terms of parenting. What are you going to do that you're going to make my 16-year-old rational in 3 months is equally impossible. And so it's managing both your expectations of your son and then your son's expectations of what's going to happen. Yeah, sure.
Have you take a step forward for our online audience? Thank
Okay,
you.
great. So yeah, I told you I moved out of my box, and now this whole thing. So, one of the things that I was asked to talk about by a number of people in various ways is how do I tell if my my son is struggling, right? What are some early things to watch out for? And so often when I talk about this clinically, is we talk about dysfunction in multiple spheres. And so any of you have had children that have been considered to have ADHD or have been diagnosed with ADHD or have gone through the assessment of that, know that usually the things that we're looking for are going to be an impairment in multiple spheres of functioning. Anxiety and depression disorders are very similar in the sense that the early warning signs are when children are struggling in multiple areas of life. If your child is completely well at home and at sports and is having a bad time at school academically, that's often not indicative of an anxiety or depressive disorder. That might be a learning disability, or that might be a mismatch between learning styles, or it might just be indicative of underlying academic prowess. But when you have someone who's struggling both on his sports teams and in the classroom and in interpersonal relationships with his friends, that's often the situation where I start to get concerned. Because there's going to be normal teenage variation in people's performance in one of those spheres, but when multiple things start to get involved, that's almost always a warning sign that this is something that's more serious, that this is not going to be the type of thing that you're just going to grow out of. The other thing is, what do I do with my kids when something bad happens? Because the world is an unfair place, and sometimes bad things happen to good kids. There are losses in the family, there are divorces, there are financial challenges, there are interpersonal challenges, you name it. Sometimes your, all-star football team screws up in the finals and you lose, and that sucks, and then life has to go on. The thing that I would encourage people to watch out for are changes that are out of keeping with how bad the event was. It's normal to be sad for a couple weeks to maybe a month if your dog dies. If it's been years, I would, that's an inappropriate response. Similarly, if for children who go through these, and the loss of a family member or a close relative or a close friend, the expectation that they're going to be back to normal or back to their normal selves within days is unrealistic. And so if they're acting that way, look for other things that might be happening. Right? So at any level of emotional response that's out of keeping with the severity of the event, that's often very troubling. And then, the last thing is about teenage angst, right? So, this is a talk at a school. Several of my old English teachers are here. There's no way that we could avoid having a reference to Shakespeare. So, the classic Hamlet problem. I'll give you a second to process it. I don't have an answer to whether or not your child is angsty or depressed. No one, throughout all of history, we've been struggling with this issue since at least the time of Shakespeare, if not before then. What I will tell you is that you're going to have to be the person that makes that decision. And the safest thing to do is always get outside help, right? So it's always going to be to talk to someone else for a second opinion, to talk to someone else. And it doesn't necessarily have to be me. It doesn't necessarily have to be, an end-stage medical professional. But talk to a family member, talk to a friend, talk to your son's guidance counselors, get some more collateral, talk to their coaches, get a better sense of what's going on in their lives. And that's going to be the information that's going to be the most helpful in terms of helping you come to that conclusion. And I recognize that this sounds, this sounds like a no-brainer, and you're probably sitting here wondering, like, why am I here, and can I still go watch the Raptors at 8? But you'd be surprised how often I end up seeing families that come with children in end-stage crisis. And you start to ask questions, because I mean, I've never met your kids, right? I don't know what's going on in their lives. And you're like, well, how are they doing on their football team? I don't know. Who are their friends? What do they like to do? What are their, in what ways are they involved in their lives? And oftentimes there's a disconnect between what you think is going on and the stuff at the, a level below that. So don't just ask, is my kid going to football practice? Ask your son's coaches, how are they doing when they're at football practice? Are they any good? Are they enjoying themselves? Do they get a lot of play time? Do they get bullied by the other people on the team? Are they an all-star and the weight of the entire team's on their shoulders? It's that level of back and forth that I think is going to make it much easier for you to figure out, is my son really succeeding? Or are they or some of these challenges part of a normal growth behavior versus is this the sign of an early slippery slope? And I make the football reference because I was probably the worst football player that St. Mike's ever let play on any of their teams, which is why I'm up here doing this. So, well, I'm serious.
Broussenko,
Yep.
just to give you a sense of time, we have just a few minutes left for this particular theme. So
Perfect.
Did you want to turn to questions now?
Yeah, I'll run through this very
Okay.
quickly, and then this is actually my last slide, and then we'll go to questions. So warning signs of things that are absolutely, if at least 2 of these things are happening to your child, they need to see a medical professional. First of them is abject helplessness. So teenage boys, by virtues of biochemistry and brain development, are inherently optimistic. There is nothing they can't do. So if they're telling you that they will not try anything because they're convinced they're going to fail, that's often a warning sign. They should have some confidence in their abilities in some sphere. Overwhelming negative thoughts. Think Eeyore. If everything about the world sucks and nothing is possible, that's often a sign of at least an early dysthymia or a pre-depression type disorder. So sudden changes in typical behavior. And we'll get back to this when we get to talk about the substance abuse piece. But sudden irritability, sleep changes, disinterest in activities, withdrawal from certain spheres, this is not a normal teenage change, right? So some of these things will change slowly, but no part of normal human development involves suddenly sleeping for 2 or 3 times more than previously, suddenly becoming irritable, suddenly becoming very withdrawn or sullen. These things warrant at least some amount of input. And then the last thing, this is much more common in boys than it is in girls, but intentional disregard for well-being. Often it's a sign of passive suicidality, and it can sometimes be a trigger or a warning sign that this is someone that's given up on the idea that that they're going to be able to get help. There's someone that's going to be giving up on the idea that the existing support structures are helpful for them. And examples of this, this is not like your kid's not wearing a bike or a helmet when they're biking. It's people that are walking indifferently into traffic. It's the people that don't seem to care about whether or not they do or don't succeed in their life. They don't show up to their tests. They just have complete disregard for their academic or athletic future. So those are often things to watch out for. And then some of the advice that I was going to give, I think I'll defer to the question and answer section, but really it was going to be focused very much on resiliency, which sounds like a made-up word, but is actually the noun form. Should I move this forward for the live stream? Okay. But resiliency is one of those things where people, which has become a very big issue even in the medical field and in a lot of the other high-performing professions, and it's this idea of how do you deal with failure. And I don't pretend to have all the answers for you, but I think one of the things that I wanted to raise in this particular session was a conversation about how do we move forward with preparing your children and preparing your sons for the idea that sometimes you will fail. And there is a learned skill, and there are learned behaviors, and there are learned defense mechanisms for what you can do to recover from failure more easily rather than less. And then that's a conversation that I'm happy to have with people offline. And if you want any specific advice, there's several good books, and there's several authors that I can recommend going forward. So I think we'll take questions.
Open it up to questions. So I just ask you to raise your hand. We've got Mr. Trenadu there, Mr. Walsh over here. Just raise your hand and we will bring the microphone to you. Yes.
I'd like to address it, from looking at our graduating students, moving towards university, moving away, as parents, just for guidelines about things that you mentioned here, but like things to be concerned about when they're away from home. You're not visually seeing concerns, and there's always a struggle for first-year university students. So what would you suggest in that matter?
So I think the biggest piece of advice that I would offer you and I would offer your children is, and this touches again on the topic of resiliency, is a realignment of expectations. So every high school student assumes that they will be excellent at all of the things that they do, right? So there are people that consistently get grades in the high 90s, and then there are people that consistently are elite athletes on their teams, and there are people that consistently are doing all of the things that are available. They're exhausting the range of opportunities that surround them. And practically speaking, going forward, that's very, very difficult to do in undergrad. It's very difficult to do really in any other sphere of life. There are very few people, and the people that are truly exceptional, who are both varsity level athletes and Rhodes Scholars and pillars of their community and whatever. And so part of that has to come from a realization that your expectation is no longer that you will be the best at everything and that you will always succeed and then nothing will be a challenge. Because everyone needs to reach a point where their skill set and their abilities start to match up with the things that they're doing. And that's a conversation that I think is better off when it happens early, because it sets people up for the disappointment and some of the struggles and the roadblocks that they'll need to overcome, both in their postgraduate academic life, but also in their postgraduate personal life. You don't get every interview, you don't get every job, you don't get every promotion, you don't immediately marry every single person that you go on a date with. And so I see actually the majority of the young adults that I see are kind of in that first or second year university transition, and a lot of them are dealing with that particular struggle of how do we, how do I realign my expectations between having always succeeded at everything in the past and only now being able to succeed at some things, but becoming average or even worse than average at other things. It was easy for me. I sucked at football, and so I got that out of the way early.
So one of the questions we got prior to this event was about how do you get help for a student who is not willing to seek help?
So, and this is very difficult for anyone, certainly any professional, any patient-facing clinician. Some amount of wellness and some amount of happiness and some amount of human success has to be the onus of the person that's receiving it. My advice, and I've given this advice both privately and also to some of the guidance counselors here, is you keep offering. So you keep offering the opportunity to get help. You keep offering, that there are different ways or different options. You ask your son what kind of help they're looking for. But people that truly, and I mean this, that truly are disinterested, will not and cannot benefit from most of the skills that I think would improve their situation. Because most of the skills that I or my colleagues or child and adolescent psychologists would be trying to teach them are coping skills. And one of the first things that you have to do for that is recognize what your limitations are and that the way that you're handling a situation is a problem. And if you don't have the insight to recognize, or you're not yet ready to accept that your responses are problematic, that help doesn't go anywhere. There's unfortunately not a magical pill that you can prescribe to teenagers that makes them happy and functional and well-adjusted.
Any other questions? Yes.
I think one of the fears that these kids have today is talking about or being able to bring their problems out into the open. And the school a while ago did these little wellness groups where they had senior students sitting with younger kids and talking about things like that. A lot of these kids, the biggest fear they have when they come to school is that somebody's going to find out that I'm not well. And somebody's going to criticize me for not being well, or somebody's going to tag me with the fact that I'm not 100%. And I think what we need to do is we need society and schools, especially because these are the development years, to develop programs where the kids can talk about these things, where the kids are told that this is common, this is not unusual, this is I wouldn't call it an epidemic, but it is common among young teenagers to go through these things, and that they have a forum. I'm going to speak from our own side. Our son went through a lot of difficulties here at St. Mike's. The school is amazing. The teachers here were amazing, but he fought. Some of the best moments he ever had was he was in a, we asked him.
Sorry, just for time, could you just ask your question, please?
Yeah.
He was in a group at CAMH of students, both younger and university students that had anxiety and depression and those issues. And he'd come out of those sessions saying, this is great. We just all walked in the room and we were all like, it was great because we felt normal. And I don't think in our society today we're allowed to do that. We're not allowed to be failures. At St. Mike's, we can only be winners. Nobody can come in here and just be an average. Unfortunately, sometimes that happens. We think that we're only winners here.
I think and this is going to echo my previous point. I think one of the best things that you can do is you can normalize the idea that even if your life is on average an upward trajectory, then that doesn't mean that you have to succeed at everything. And that's not to say that you shouldn't challenge your children to be not ambitious or not motivated or not strive for things. But it might mean that you have a more honest conversation about some of your own failures and your own struggles. And that there's a tendency in some families to shield their children from some of the difficulties that the parents or their siblings or someone else is facing. The world exists whether or not you try to be a barrier between your child or not, right? And that world is going to continue to exist outside of that, and these are going to be undeniable realities. Some people will be sad, some people will struggle with anxiety, some people won't be able to perform at the level that they want to. And it's important that the home is the most important place for learning. This is a learned behavior, and this is a learned experience. And so if you don't normalize it in the home, then you're never going to be able to get society to do the rest of the work for you.
We are going to move on now to our second theme of the evening, and the focus of that is substance use.
Great. So my next, prompt for you is the question of, is my son on drugs? And so this is actually, I think that's a geography textbook. And touching back to this point, I think recently, so recreational drug use has certainly become, if not more socially accepted, then at least a more common topic in the social conversation. And actually, one of the things that CAMH does is we put out a youth survey of Ontario students every single year, and about 60% of eligible students respond to this. And so I only have data up until 2017, which is where this slide is from. And I'm going to direct you to look at the right-hand slide. And so, and just to be clear, all of these things are illegal. No grade 12 student can legally purchase or consume alcohol. But let's say about 68% of them report that they have. And same thing with cannabis. 37% of them report that they have. And if you look at this, statistically speaking, your son probably is doing drugs. And part of what I'm here to talk to you about is that's okay. What you want to avoid is you want to avoid creating a situation where there is a problematic relationship to substances. And I'm saying that from a position of 30 years of failed public health efforts for absolute abstinence. And there's the evidence does not support, and I doubt that it will continue to support in the future, the idea that you can simply convince young adults to eliminate these things from their lives. What is going to be more helpful are going to be honest conversations about what kinds of situations and what kinds of scenarios are dangerous. And so the one statistic that I want to draw your attention to is this. So this 14% of non-medical use of a prescription drug. So in layman's terms, that's prescription drug abuse. And I'm going to show you where they're getting it.
Okay, Mr. Thomas. Now, take these twice a day, always with food, and finish the prescription. Also, when your son Jake steals some of these from the medicine cabinet, he's going to take them to a party where he'll share them with a girl he likes named Leanne, who's going to drink some alcohol and then have convulsions and a cardiovascular collapse. Any questions?
For the tools you need to talk to your kids about prescription abuse, go to CanadaDrugFree.org.
So that is a nonprofit organization whose entire raison d'etre, the only thing that they do is they pay a bunch of money for glossy TV spots like that, raising awareness about the fact that lots of people, not only teenagers, but particularly teenagers, are abusing prescription drugs that the original source probably isn't aware of. And so, there's a lot of recommendations there. Most of them are impractical or inactionable, and so I'm not going to repeat them. But the number one biggest thing that you can do is you can take back your old prescriptions for anything. So there is no reason to, if you haven't finished the course of something for whatever reason, don't keep it at home just in case. With the exception of those of you who are physicians, you probably, and I don't mean this to be condescending or dismissive, you probably don't have a great sense of when you do or don't need whatever prescription medication that is. They might have expired, they might interact with some new medication that you've been on, and the costs of replacing some of these things are pretty irrelevant. But the risks of leaving bottles of painkillers or benzodiazepines or antidepressants or anything like that lying around the house are pretty significant. And this is one of the biggest issues with teenagers today, is both in terms of recreational use and both in terms of intentional overdose. So I see someone at least once a day or so that has intentionally overdosed on someone else's antidepressant. It doesn't work, but it's still not fantastic. So the other thing that I'm going to recommend is have a sense of how much you have and what it does and what it's for. And the next question that everyone's going to ask is, well, are my kids really so savvy that they're going to figure out what to do with this stuff? Yes. So who knows what this is? Scream it out. Yeah, in the back. What is this person doing?
It's nitrous oxide.
That's right. See, perfect. Audience participation. So this is a whippet. They're called that. They're very popular in Australia, and they're more recently becoming more popular in North America. Whippets are the company that makes them. They're nitrous oxide canisters. The legitimate use for them is to essentially aerate cream to make whipped cream. So those of you who are home bakers have probably used them. What you do is you can get a little cracker. They look like that. You can buy them on Alibaba for, I think, $1.99 will buy you 20. They come from China. You connect them to a little nitrous oxide canister. You attach it to a balloon, and then you inhale and exhale nitrous oxide. This is also laughing gas that you'll often have experienced at the dentist. And we also use this for anesthesia for pregnant women when they're delivering. So lots of you probably have had experience with this. I would be shocked if the rate, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but I would be shocked if the rate of people that knew that this was a drug of abuse in this audience exceeded 25%. I'd be shocked if it exceeded 10%, right? So this is one of those things where, if your child wants to get high, all you need is, $1.99 and some commonly found kitchen supplies, and now you're huffing nitrous oxide, which by the way, as a counterpoint, in terms of all the things that teenagers do, this is actually one of the safest. The mechanism of action is pretty benign. The duration of onset is about 90 seconds. So this is one of the safer things that's available. But I mean, look, this is like a how-to guide that I don't make these, right? I Googled this on the internet. It took me about 30 seconds to find a how-to guide for nitrous oxide. Like, I'm not this clever. And so this is one of the things where I think it's warranted for you to have a conversation with your children about the things that they're exposed to at parties, about what to do in those situations, and about normalizing some of this behavior. And part of that is gonna be being honest, both in terms of some of the experiences that you might have had, and some of the temptations that you might have faced, and some of the consequences for this. Because the moment that you say, you are absolutely not allowed to do any of these things ever, don't ever tell me you're at a place where these things happen, is when your son does one of these and then is offered some pills, and now suddenly they've mixed a sedative with nitrous oxide, and now they're unconscious. And so I would encourage you, as a general parenting strategy in the face of illicit drugs, to create, and all of the evidence, most of this is from the States, where this is a much bigger issue, says that this is the best strategy. A no questions asked, call me anytime in the middle of the night, wherever you are, I'll come pick you up. And I'm not going to ask why or what you saw there and why you were uncomfortable, and there are no consequences for that. So someone had asked me in one of the earlier questions about what I think you should do as a general strategy to discipline children. This is the extent of my area of expertise. But if you're going to do one thing that's going to reduce the risk that your child's going to be in an uncomfortable situation with recreational drugs, that would be my biggest advice too. So what are some signs? I'm also mindful of the time. So what are signs of drug abuse? Usually the biggest thing is change in behavior. So remember, we talked about this, right? So teenagers are 2 to 4 drinks deep at any given point. The chances that they're going to be able to balance this stuff successfully with their lives and to run the fine line of recreational but not dependent use is very low. The vast majority of highly functional adults that start using recreational drugs eventually develop a pattern of abuse or dependence. So the expectation that your 16-year-old is going to be able to hide this for you for any extended period of time is unrealistic. They're not that smart. I was one not that long ago. I couldn't have pulled it off. So absenteeism, dissatisfaction with activities, and inclusive behaviors. And what I mean by that is, if your son has always been more secretive and more private, that might just be his normal behavior. If your son was previously very open and is now hiding things, that usually is a sign that something is up. And it might not be drugs. It might be something else. They might be depressed. They might be in a new relationship they don't want you to know about. They might be cheating on their math tests, or they might be taking some supplements to become a better athlete or whatever. But chances are, whatever that change in behavior was, it wasn't great. And I would encourage everyone to explore that. And I would encourage everyone to communicate with the school, communicate with their coaches, communicate with the other important people and authority figures in their lives to get a better sense of what's going on. And then so the specifics about, are there signs that my child is doing X or Y, really depends on the substance. But generally, the types of things that happen at parties tend to be stimulants as opposed to downers, which in the long run are actually safer for young adults. And so the good news is that there aren't a lot of teenagers that are getting into the opiate painkiller crisis, but unfortunately that's changing as recreational drugs that were previously stimulants have now become adulterated with fentanyl. Yeah. Yeah.
If we have questions, I ask you to raise your hand, and we will send a microphone to you.
Thanks.
One of the questions that came to us prior was on substance use, was how do I recognize the signs, which you just talked about, but what kind of help in terms of next steps should parents be looking to get?
So,
and where?
Excellent question. So, no, there are no substance abuse treatments that will accept unwilling participants. Flat out. I would suggest that you talk to your son about the issue, or daughter for that matter. I mean, I'm speaking to parents of at least boys, but certainly these are non-gender specific issues. But the next steps would be to talk to your family doctor, your pediatrician. Those are going to be the people that will often have the best access to resources and will at the very least be able to connect you with a group that's that's able to move forward. In terms of specific recommendations, it really depends on the type of substance, the extent of abuse, the duration of abuse, some of the other underlying depression or anxiety problems, and rarely in any age group, not just teenagers and young adults, rarely is substance abuse just an independent issue. It's often related with anxiety and depressive disorders, and so usually multiple people or multiple groups of people need to be involved. But the best place to start, and certainly the easiest place that almost everyone's going to have access to, will be their family doctor or their pediatrician. And that's at least also very helpfully free. And so, some of the residential treatment programs can be quite expensive, and so you really want to get a better sense of what the next options are before going down that route. But certainly talk to someone. This does not get better on its own.
Okay, we are going to move now on to the third topic of the evening, and that is about vaping.
Great. So, I stole this joke earlier, but I've been holding this in my hand the whole time. So some of you might have noticed, some of you might have one. They're actually kind of annoying. I don't want to fidget with it. So this is a JUUL. We can pass this around for audience enjoyment. This is the most common brand of vapes that were as of November 2018. They legally can't be very heavily marketed and targeted towards young adults. And so part of the conversation that I wanted to have in this section was actually about the general umbrella of things that will eventually become legal but aren't yet for your teenager. So these are legal. You can own one. You can't smoke it on school grounds, but you can buy this as an adult. I actually ordered this online for $20. I don't smoke it. This is just for the purpose of demonstration. I didn't need to verify my identity. It came with 4 pods of delicious mango flavor. They're high nicotine. I could smoke this for days and become an addict. It's funny that I say that, but if I'd been holding an unlit cigarette here, every single person would have noticed. But you see, there we go. I did this in front of the guidance counselors too, and just to normalize this experience. And the school actually has one, and I've shown them what it is. But the whole point of these was to make it so that smoking, which has at some point has developed a lot of significant social stigma and wasn't cool for a while, got cool again. Because it doesn't smell like smoke, it doesn't taste like smoke, it doesn't obviously look like it gives you cancer. They're cool. I mean, that thing looks like Apple designed it in California, right? It's cool and it's sleek. It charges from a USB drive. The issue isn't so much whether or not children are going to access this as adults. There's nothing that you or I can do to stop them, just like there's nothing that you or I can do to stop them from buying alcohol or stop them from buying cannabis. All of those things are now legal. The question is, how do we have policies in place, and how do we as a school and as a community and as a group of parents support it so that your children aren't getting addicted to nicotine at an age where, again, prefrontal cortex, they're too young to know that this is going to be a bad idea. Just like none of you would encourage your 14 or 15-year-old to take up smoking or to take up binge drinking, I would suggest that the right attitude towards e-cigarettes and vapes is really one of it's going to be an unsupportive attitude in whatever way that looks like in your home. And I recognize that because I'm talking to a group of representative adults. Like a number of you probably do or have smoked, and some of you probably use vapes. But I don't think any of you would encourage your children to start that habit if they haven't already. So this is a poll by Vox. So the rate of cigarette smoking in 12th graders is now at an all-time low, and it's conveniently been replaced by the rate of vaping, which is 1 in 4. And I suspect that actually kind of underrepresents the experience. Any party that you go to, regardless of whether or not there are drugs or alcohol at, you will find JUULs. I say that with the confidence of someone that hasn't gone to one of those in years. So the question that that your children will push back to you is, why is this bad? And speaking with as a representative of my profession, speaking confidently as a medical doctor, I cannot tell you why e-cigarettes are bad. I can tell you that nicotine is addictive, and I would not encourage anyone to become addicted to a substance that they are not already addicted to. And that is the extent of the documented literature on this topic. And the reason for that is very straight. I'll get out of the way so you can see this. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. The longitudinal studies that prove that cigarettes were bad for you took place over decades, and a lot of those links are only found after people developed lung cancer and oropharyngeal cancers, which are the end-stage complications, and those things take years. And so e-cigarettes and vapes haven't been around long enough for us to figure out in what ways exactly they're bad for your children. But what we do know is that nicotine is incredibly addictive, and there's some early evidence that shows that nicotine changes cognitive behavior in developing adults. And so teenagers are uniquely susceptible to the stimulant and appetite depressant effects of nicotine, and are thus much more likely to become lifelong smokers the earlier that they start. And the problem is, if in 10 years we find out that JUULs cause horrible lung disease and they become illegal, all of the people that were previously JUULing are now still addicted to nicotine and will have to go to smoking or some other nicotine delivery alternative, which is the problem that I think the manufacturers really downplay when they offer this as an alternative for adult smokers, and as an alternative for people that want to minimize their risk of complications from cigarettes. I'll let you go through that meme. Yeah. Reading comprehension for memes goes down as people get older. So it takes about 30 seconds for a group of 12-year-olds to laugh at this, and takes a good minute for a group of adults. Again, I don't make these, I just find them. So, what are you going to do? This is, and this is one of the conversations that I think could also come up in the questions, what kind of boundaries do we set around vapes? From the school's perspective, what kind of boundaries do we set around enforcing vaping? So there is an act. It is, you cannot use one of these in a school in Ontario. It's non-negotiable. The government says no. And so the school, from that perspective, is obligated to have a zero-tolerance policy towards vaping. They don't have any other choice. But part of the conversation, and I have this conversation with a lot of people pretty frequently, is what happens when you want to do a thing and it's legal in some places and it's not legal in others, right? So if I went into a church with a six-pack of beer and I sat there and I started drinking, people would tell me that's socially inappropriate. I can go do that in a lot of other places, but it presumably is not, it's not considered to be socially appropriate to do that in church. And part of adolescence and part of the, the development process is to learn that there are social rules that might seem arbitrary or that might apply to you in some places and not others, and how to negotiate that. And then, the conversation with vapes is very similar. Regardless of whether or not you think this is a good idea or is a bad idea, you can't do it until you're 19, and you certainly can't do it at school. And I would encourage all of you to support this school and other schools in other areas where e-cigarettes and vapes are banned, in at least enforcing and setting those boundaries, regardless of what your own personal beliefs or opinions are about vaping. That would at least be my bottom line, and that would be the angle that I would recommend that you use to approach it. And so this is the part where I'll turn the floor over to both questions about this topic and also general questions. And if anyone wants to see this, you can go play with the JUUL.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Okay. Well, luckily
There's one over there.
Okay.
You said vaping's not allowed in schools. Does that include universities? So is a university considered a school?
Yes.
Okay.
Most places that are public under the act that was previously mentioned in Ontario, just like you can't smoke in bars and restaurants and on university campuses. Anywhere that you can't smoke, you can't vape.
You showed us the statistics and the surge there in one of your slides. What concerns you most as a medical professional about the increase in vaping?
So again, nicotine is incredibly addictive, and it doesn't matter how or why you got started being addicted to nicotine. Once you're there, we know that it's incredibly hard to quit smoking. It's one of the hardest things that people will do in their lives. Most people fail in numerous amount of times. And even as a harm reduction strategy, the idea that vapes are completely risk-free isn't well borne out by the evidence. We just don't know. And I wouldn't want to get people committed to a lifelong cycle of nicotine addiction without having all the information.
One of the things that you alluded to earlier is that there perhaps are people in the audience, parents who vape and are fine with it and are fine if their kids vape as well. However, there's zero tolerance in the school. So how do you go about managing that if I'm a parent and my child is exposed to that?
I mean, I think it's about having a conversation about boundary setting, right? Is that you can do some things in some places and you can't do some things in other places. And there are hard and concrete limits around vaping at school, and those you don't have a choice about whether or not to enforce those. It's a government of Ontario thing. It's like paying taxes. I'm sure there's some people who don't think that they should pay taxes, but I can't imagine any of them encouraging their children to become tax evaders.
We do have a question back here.
Mine is more of a general question.
Sure.
Those behaviors you said that should be concerning to parents when looking out for our children's mental health, what sorts of questions are effective when gauging our children's health, either when they're in the house or, as another woman said before, when they are away at university and our ways of contacting them are limited?
So that's a great question, because it's you want to pick these things up, and it's natural as a parent to start to want to pick up on some of these trends sooner rather than later. Like, you don't want it to become the end of the semester to realize that your first year university student has failed all of their classes because they're struggling with anxiety. And so I would normalize, long before then, conversations that are just to check in on how people are doing and about their mood and about their relationships with their peers and the things that they like and the things that they don't like about school. So when I was in medical school, they taught us to ask students about what their favorite class was in school, as it's a report building exercise. It's like, you're 10, do you like math more, do you like science more? I've actually found since then that the opposite of that question tends to be a lot more useful. So I ask people what they don't like. What is your least favorite thing about undergrad? Are you happy at school? Yeah. Okay, what do you like the least? And I think that normalizes the idea that you're allowed to be dissatisfied or that you're allowed to not have a good time. I see a lot of people nodding their heads. And that's a way that opens a conversation it prompts people to this idea that they should find something they're unhappy with, and you'd be surprised how far you can go with that. So if you're going to ask, just one general question, in whatever way it makes sense in your family, right? Everyone's a little bit different in that way, but that would be where I would start. If you're talking about things where your kids are gone and it's hard to see them for a while, I would make sure that you ask some questions about things if they're missing or worrisome. What does your roommate like to do? Oh, I don't talk to my roommate, right? Red flag. Do you have any classes in the evenings? Oh, I don't go to any of them. Red flag. And things like that. So start off asking screening questions about parts of the normal, university experience. And they don't have to get all of them, right? So some people are well-adjusted and they don't like their roommate. But start asking questions about normal parts of that experience. And if you get any answers to those that are very dismissive, I would probe further.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sort of similar to
Sure.
what you were just talking about in terms of the questions that you're asking. And when students or patients come to you, and if we're talking about these questions, they've already reached that point that they need that help.
Yeah.
At which point, would you or your profession have a checklist of items that they go through? And if so, would that checklist help parents prevent or be aware of indicative behaviors?
Absolutely. So you actually do know the answer to this question because I walked through it with the guidance counselors here. Sometimes I get a slow pitch and I just knock it out of the park, and it's really easy. So there's a bunch of screens, and I'm happy to share some of these resources either via the distribution email that are they're pretty straightforward. So there's some screens that we use, especially in clinical mental health, for depression and anxiety screening. And they're batteries of, so the depression screen is 9 questions, the anxiety screen is 7 questions, and it's they take 30 seconds to complete. And then if you can look at those and they give you a pretty good kind of ballpark of, is my child doing well or is my child not doing well? The timeline for the answers is the last 2 weeks. And so it'll be questions like, are you sleeping more than usual? Are you less interested in activities? Is your concentration bad or is your memory bad? There's a couple other things. And so those are very useful screening tools if you think that something's going wrong. And you don't need to be an expert clinician to interpret these. But if you're seeing a bunch of answers in the all the time or most of the time column, that might mean that they should seek someone with specialized skills. In terms of kind of global function, and so I talked to the guidance counselors at St. Mike's about this. It's something called the HEAD screen. I think it was developed in Edmonton in the 70s, and it's a general approach to taking a history from any child. So every pediatrician or every medical student on pediatrics will go through and be able to tell you what the H and the E and the D stand for. But it's a global profile of how are you doing at home, how are things at school, what are your activities, are there any safety risks, how are you doing with your peer group, and there's some specific questions again that are kind of high yield in all of those. That can really give you, at a glance, snapshot of how well a child is doing. Because remember, I'm interviewing your children for 30 to 60 minutes at most, and on the basis of that, I'm making a decision about whether or not they're well. So with some targeted questioning, you can get to the bottom and you can get a pretty good gestalt. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but the accuracy rate for whether or not I can pick up a child that's very depressed as opposed to a child that's having a bad time is pretty good. And so you can get meaningful answers to some of these questions without spending hours and hours prying into their personal lives.
So one of the more popular series of questions we got in preparation for this event was about gaming.
Yeah.
Specifically gaming, and is there a link between gaming and depression?
So that's an excellent question. I actually wasn't sure how to answer that. So when I was looking at it, the answer is it depends. And so gaming as a broad category is very broad. As a general category, there's lots of different types of gaming. There's violent gaming, there's strategy gaming, there's sports gaming, what have you. And it's similar to saying, is my child's fascination with sports going to detract from school? And the answer is, well, maybe. And so in terms of, and I'm going to use video gaming specifically, it's an arena that can be very helpful because like any other competitive event, it can be one of those things that teaches children resiliency. So just like playing on a team with others can be helpful because it can teach children that you will not always you'll not always win, you'll have to work with others. There's hard work and preparation that's required to be good at something. Video games can be an avenue for that for children who, for whatever reason, don't enjoy athletic pursuits in the same way. So that's the best case scenario. So if that's what your child is doing in terms of gaming, fantastic, don't stop that. For children who are socially withdrawn, who are spending a lot more time gaming, who are doing that at the detriment of other activities that they like, usually that's a symptom of depression and not a precursor to depression. So your son or daughter are almost certainly not going to start doing those things and then become depressed or anxious or withdrawn. They're going to be doing those things because they are anxious, depressed, or withdrawn, because they're struggling to have meaningful social interactions outside of that sphere, and because things aren't going well at school, because they feel overwhelmed with some of their courses or some of the academic pressure that's on them. And so in that case, games become a form of escape. And escapism as a coping strategy is generally quite poor.
Dr. Broussenko, we're going to
Yeah.
have to cut it off there.
Sure.
So that concludes our event for this portion. Thank you for being here and joining us online on Facebook. The live broadcast is supporting your son's mental wellness conversation. Our sincere thanks to Dr. Mark Broussenko for his time and his insight. And a huge thanks as well to our technical crew led by Stephen Klein, our student crew who are manning the cameras and who helped organize this event. A link to this live broadcast will be available on our website, stmichaelscollegeschool.com/parenttalks, starting tomorrow. Thank you for your presence and participation at Parent Talks at St. Michael's College School.
Thanks very much.
For those of you in the room, we are going to continue the conversation, so if you have questions, we ask you to continue to remain seated just so that we have some structure to this portion. Dr.